Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair here at Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and of course, welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. If you don't yet support our work, please do so by visiting www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. Now on to today's briefing. Tensions are rising both within Israel's governing coalition and between Israel and the United States due to recent announcements related to the West Bank. These include the greenlighting of new settlement construction deep in the West Bank, outside of the settlement blocks, as well as the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs as terror organizations due to their alleged association with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. We are absolutely delighted to be joined today by Tal Shalev, political correspondent at Walla News, who will provide insight into how these developments fit into the Israeli government's approach to the West Bank, as well as the Palestinian issue, and their potential impact on Israeli domestic politics and relations with the Biden administration. As always, we welcome your questions, so please type them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later today on our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org/briefings. With that, Tal, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. So, Tal, for starters, would you please walk us through the recent news pertaining to Israeli actions in the West Bank, including the approval of settlement housing and the designation of the Palestinian NGOs as terror organizations? Specifically, what do these developments entail and why are they notable?
Okay, so first I think I want to start in locating where the government currently is, because that's kind of the background to all of these recent announcements. So basically the government has now existed, it's almost 5 months, 4.5 months, and as we speak, it's facing one of its most crucial weeks so far, because it's going to pass the budget in the second and third reading, supposedly by the end of this week. And this is a really important milestone from the government's point of view. And this has been a milestone from the beginning. And the notion has been, it's a very complicated coalition. So the notion has been up until now that we want to postpone all of these headaches until after the budget passes, because the budget supposedly will create some kind of stability for the government, and it'll be more, I would say, easier to have these confrontations. That has been the approach inside the government. That's also been the approach outside the government. If we talk about the administration or we talk about other foreign players, then, one of the things that Lapid, the foreign minister, and Bennett have been saying is, let us pass the budget and then we'll start talking about policy or changes. Let's give us, this leverage so we can breathe. And basically, since the government was established and up until now, when we're passing the budget, the coalition has been in what I've been calling a swallowing frogs mode. Meaning that, this is a very complicated coalition. It has left-wing parties, it has right-wing parties, it has the Arab partner, Ram, and everyone has been kind of aware of the fact that this is not the time. This is the time, and this is the era where we have to put aside all of our differences and just try and unite on this goal of passing a budget. Just to say that, passing a budget by itself, it would be considered a regular action or typical procedure, just because of the, political situation and chaos in Israel in the past 3 years. Then Netanyahu didn't pass a budget, and in the previous government, he dodged passing a budget. So this government, Lapid and Bennett, really put the budget as, I would say, their #1 goal. And the notion has been, we'll put aside everything else. So as the budget came closer and closer approach, then what happened was that basically people are starting to feel more secure and starting to appeal to their bases on both sides, and both sides are finding it much more difficult to swallow frogs. And what happened basically last week and the week before was that there was many different events that came together and created this notion of, wow, there's this big crisis going on inside the government. But to really, in Israeli politics, many times when you think that something is house of cards, it usually turns out to be just like a comedy of errors. And what actually happened is really that three different procedures just kind of coincided. They weren't really coordinated. They just coincided by chance or by circumstance, or by the very weird sense of humor that the Middle East has. And yes, we had within 1 week, we had two major settlement announcements, one planning announcement and another tender cell marketing announcement, which were done by two different branches of the government, right? One branch is in the civic administration under Bennett and under Benny Gantz, and then you have Zev Elkin, the right winger, who is now the housing minister, who he just felt this is the time for him to announce new tenders. He didn't even go through Bennett. And at the same time, that same weekend was exactly the weekend when Benny Gantz declared the 6 NGOs as terror organizations. Now, I think that in anything like that in previous governments, or at least in the past 12 years, any action similar to what Benny Gantz did, the declaration of a Palestinian NGO to declare it a terror organization, I actually think that in any previous government, it would go by as a non-issue. The new challenge here is that for the first time in 12 years, there's a real left-wing element inside the government who suddenly woke up one morning and they saw, what is all of this right-wing things going around us? But it's not as if Benny Gantz was, when he announced with the terror organization announcement, it wasn't coordinated with Zev Elkin. It wasn't even coordinated with Naftali Bennett. It was like an action that was a procedure that Benny Gantz didn't really understand the political implications of it, and he probably didn't even care that much, because as you know or not, he doesn't necessarily want this government to be very strong, but that's for a different discussion. I just want to say that all of these events kind of coincided and created, of course, both an internal uproar from the left-wing parties and also a diplomatic uproar from not only the United States, but also Europe and the UN. And I say that this is just the promo, because after the budget, all of this noise will become much louder, both inside and outside, because after the budget, the left-wing parties and the right-wing parties inside the government, they all have constituents, and they all want to prove themselves to their constituents. I would say the right-wing parties not necessarily have a constituency, and they even more need to prove themselves to find their constituency. So I do predict that this is just the promo. This has just been the promo and the teaser for what's going to come ahead in the upcoming weeks after the budget.
So I guess you would say buckle our seatbelts on that one. Tal, but Prime Minister Bennett has publicly adopted Micha Goodman's political philosophy of shrinking the conflict as his policy regarding Israeli-Palestinian issues, meaning, among other things, that his government will seek to bolster the Palestinian Authority and decrease sources of tension between Israelis and Palestinians. How does Bennett reconcile his philosophy with his government's decision to greenlight settlement construction in controversial, non-consensus settlements deep in the West Bank?
So first of all, Bennett is under a lot of pressure, right? I don't think I remember any prime minister in Israel who, of course, has been so weak. He's not a strong prime minister. This is not the days of Netanyahu, in which Netanyahu would say something and everyone would do it, or that other ministers in Netanyahu's government were so afraid of him because he was a strong prime minister, so everything was very centralized under Bennett. Not everything is in Bennett's control. He's a very weak prime minister. He's weak inside his own coalition because you know, when you're so weak, you have 6 seats in the coalition and not much more in the polls. This creates a problem, a leadership problem for him inside his coalition. And that's something that needs to be remembered, that we have a prime minister who doesn't really have a base, or at least has a very scattered base. And he's under a lot of political pressure. You know, there's about 50% of Israelis who are very happy with this government, but they will not be voting for Bennett next time because they're not from Bennett's camp. And Bennett is trying to appease his voters. And the way to appease his voters goes through the Yesha Council, for instance, and it goes through the settlers, which the settler leadership is divided amongst himself between Likud and between those who support the coalition. So Bennett is trying, to tread this mill. Now, when Bennett says, his policy is this government will not annex and this government will not make any peace agreement, basically you should expect, it sounds different from what Netanyahu used to say, because Netanyahu used to say he's for a two-state solution, but on the ground he did exactly the opposite. So it's basically going to be the same policy. It's just it's declared differently. So Bennett will try to eat what he can, and I think especially he's trying to eat or gain what he can before the budget passed, because he knows that after the budget he will have much less mercy from the American administration. We have the issue of the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem coming up after the budget. That is also going to create a lot of problems for Bennett amongst his base. Not only Bennett, when we say Bennett, it also refers to, of course, Ayelet Shaked, who is a very significant figure in this government, but also to everyone in Gideon Sa'ar's party. They need to prove to their constituency that this government is not a left-wing government, while the majority of the people in the government do come from, I would say, the center-left side. So I think Bennett would prefer, he would prefer to just ignore the Palestinian issue, just not talk about it. But that of course is not possible. But he's trying to, eat from all worlds as much as he can before the pressure becomes real after the budget.
Let's now turn to the United States. The announcement of settlement construction prompted a strong rebuke from the Biden administration, with State Department spokesperson Ned Price expressing deep concern over the plan. How will this move impact relations between the Bennett government and the Biden administration and U.S.-Israel relations in general going forward?
So I think it's too early to tell. From what I sense, the way that Bennett and his government are being accepted in the international community is that they do enjoy, in many ways, they enjoy the aura of being the not Bibi government. And many players in the international arena prefer Bennett over Netanyahu, including probably the Biden administration. I mean, this is the devil that, this is a new devil, but it's one that is much easier for them to control and much less, playing with internal U.S. politics. I don't think we'll see Bennett playing the same games, of course, that Netanyahu used to play. So I think it's really up to the administration and to what their tone is going to be and how tough they want to go on Bennett. Do they want to turn this into a confrontation? Do they want to turn the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into an issue? I'm under the impression that they're not. And if they're not into turning it into an issue, then yes, we'll have these Ned Price announcements maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks or once every month or two. But at the end of the day, it won't have a real impact on the relationship. As we can see, the Bennett administration is continuing, the Abraham Accords approach. It's continuing the regional approach and even expanding it because it's really keen on, enhancing relationships with Egypt and Jordan, where Netanyahu is not necessarily so keen to warming up relationships. So I think that it really depends on and also under how much political pressure the Biden administration will be inside from the Democrats and from the progressive Democrats to reprimand Israel. But I think if I would have to say, I think don't expect too much from this government. I mean, I would lower expectations. It's good enough that this is a government, by the way, that has this outstanding revolutionary relationship with Israeli Arabs, right? I mean, so I would just look at the pros and the cons and kind of like look at only at the positive parts. But it really depends on how the administration wants to take this forward. I have to say that not only in the US, in Europe as well, I sense that no one wants to have this fight anymore. It's, no one wants to have this, and many times it feels like, yes, the State Department is back to putting out condemnations, and yes, that of course inspires other European countries. But at the end of the day, it's kind of, that's the procedure, and we move on, and we wake up the next morning, and everything's fine. So yeah.
Except when it's not fine, right, Tal?
Of course, right. So that the heart, of course.
Right.
Just to say that this is a very fragile coalition. Yeah. Anything like extreme international pressure will bring it down. Now, I don't think that necessarily has to be, I don't think that yes or not Bibi is necessarily what's important to foreign leaders. But at the end of the day, politics and international relations and international politics is about choosing between your options, and sometimes, living with the how do you say it? The least, you know what I mean. It's the least.
The lesser of two evils.
Exactly, the lesser of two evils. Thank you.
And I do want to remind our audience to please type in questions. I have some in the queue, but I'd love some more. So please feel free to ask away, and we'll get to your questions in the second half. Tal, while Naftali Bennett may be a right-wing prime minister, his government, of course, consists of politicians from across the political spectrum. Labor and Meretz openly came out against the announcement of settlement construction and the designation of Palestinian NGOs as terror organizations. And there's reason to suspect that alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid feels similarly. What impact will this have on the coalition going forward, especially given that, as you mentioned, its survival is dependent on passing a budget in the next 2 weeks? What are the prospects for the coalition making it through a full term once the budget passes?
Well, if they pass the budget by the end of this week, then the common notion is that it'll have at least 2 years of stability. The next milestone, the next, I would say, dramatic milestone will be in August 2021, which is 2023, which is when the rotation agreement between Bennett and Lapid is supposed to be fulfilled, and Lapid is supposed to become prime minister. That being said, the minute that the budget passes, even if the government falls before that, then Lapid will probably become prime minister, even if it's for a very, very short term, even if it's only for the election or for the interim agreement, because that's part of the agreement. Now, I think that the left-wing parties in the government are so I think they're divided. First of all, we shouldn't treat Meretz necessarily as labor. I think for Meretz, the internal politics there are a bit more complicated. Nitzan Horowitz is not a strong leader inside Meretz, and the party is built out of a lot of independent actors and people who have their own ideologies and agenda, who are sometimes stronger than those of Nitzan Horowitz. And also, what we should note that there's a difference between the ministers in the government and the members of Knesset. Nitzan Horowitz is not a member of the Knesset. He quit the Knesset. He's only a minister, and he's the health minister, and he's very, very happy in his job, but he doesn't have to vote for some of the controversial bills that come up in the Knesset, and he doesn't have to be embarrassed by bills that he needs to vote against because of coalition, discipline. And there's a divide between what happens in the Knesset and what happens around the government table. But for both parties, it's very difficult to be part of this government, A, because of Naftali Bennett, B, because to begin with, they're not necessarily in very ideological portfolios. That was one of the first demands of the right-wing parties, was to declude or exclude Horowitz and Merav Michaeli from hardcore ideological portfolios. So Ayelet Shaked is interior minister. She has a day-to-day access and day-to-day dealings with issues that have to do with Palestinians, but Merav Michaeli and Nitzan Horowitz, they don't have much, in transportation and health. They don't have so much that they can do about the Palestinian issue. And Bennett also, of course, abides much more with the right-wing policy. So in many ways, they feel like they were deprived, and they feel like they want to demand back their honor. And also they feel like, wait, we're stronger. And Merav Michaeli says, I'm 7 seats. Why do I need to be surprised by Zev Elkin, from Tikva Hadasha, from Gideon Saar's party? Why do I need to be surprised by tenderness, by settlement tenders? And there is a demand within the left-wing parties in the coalition, both Meretz and Labor. There's a growing demand to kind of change, the way decisions are being made. But I'm not sure it'll work, because I think that Bennett, in many ways, he prefers not to have these big decisions, not to bring them to a wide forum. If you look back at all of the big things that have happened since the government was established, none of them were brought to the security cabinet before they happened. Benny Gantz went to meet Abu Mazen in the beginning of August, a historic meeting in which he offered and he negotiated concessions and gestures to Mahmoud Abbas. And that wasn't brought to the cabinet beforehand, meaning that the right-wing ministers, Gideon Saar, Yoaz Hendel, Ayelet Shaked, they were fuming. The same way, when Benny Gantz announced the terror organizations, that didn't come to the cabinet as well. And that left the left-wing ministers fuming and angry. And I think that Bennett prefers it to be that way, because if he brings it to a vote, then he might be embarrassed. He could be embarrassed both ways. There might be a deadlock. There could be a majority on the left wing. There could be a majority on the right wing, and then bringing these issues to a wide forum in which everyone is heard is very problematic for Bennett, because it could put him in a very tough place.
Tal, I just want to ask a follow-up before I get to another couple of questions and then get to audience questions. So my follow-up question on the budget is this. I think at one point people assumed that if the budget passed, that would basically be a guarantee that this coalition would survive for the next couple of years, and then Lapid would take over rotation as prime minister. It's starting to feel like maybe that assumption is not necessarily correct. So while I think no one wants to see another round of elections, because after all, there were 4 in 2 years, and not only is it disruptive, but it also costs a lot of money that could be used for much more important issues in Israel, whether it be education, healthcare, housing, you name it. What is your sense as far as, assuming they do pass a budget, and that's also an assumption, I think, but if they do pass a budget, from where you sit today on November 2nd, how much do you think that will inoculate this coalition government against something else that will either cause a no confidence vote or cause it to fall apart, and then we're back in new elections?
I honestly think that it can fall apart every day, especially after the budget. We live in a very volatile area. It's a fragile government. There's a lot of goodwill, yeah, but goodwill has its limits. And we can see that, tensions are boiling up both. By the way, the left-right tensions are much more difficult than those between those between the coalition and Ra'am and Mansour Abbas, which is interesting. It's easier to find coexistence between the government and the Arab partner, and then between the Jews, the left and right Jewish parties. I think that the tensions are very high. I think that every security incident, God forbid, could create a big problem for both the left-wing parties. You know, we have people in Meretz who are supporters of, you know, this government has people in Meretz who are supporters of breaking the silence, of Shobrim Shtika. And on the other hand, we have people in this government who are supporters of Im Tirtzu. Not necessarily right now, because now Im Tirtzu are their enemies, but Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett, right? We know where they come from, and people in their party are very, very right, come from a very, very right-wing ideology. So anything small can basically blow this up. And as I said, Bennett is a weak prime minister. So, and with all the goodwill, he can't. At least it seems he's finding it difficult to control things. And when things are in chaos and even if there's goodwill, and when there's not one specific controller, then I think that it can fall apart every day. I also think that Lapid knows this. And I think that Lapid knew this to begin with. Like, I know that, you know, in Israeli media and journalists and political commentators like myself, we obsess about, will Lapid see the rotation agreement fulfilled or not? One of the reasons we obsess about it is because, you know, the previous rotation agreement was broken pretty fast. But the other reason but I do think that Lapid, I actually know that when Lapid established his government, he knew that there's a wide chance that he will not become prime minister, but he thinks his prize will be the recognition of his camp as A, as a leader, and B, as someone who succeeded to replace Netanyahu. And so, and by the way, from all of the parties in the government, Lapid is the only one who actually, well, not the only one, but Lapid is the only one who has nothing to be afraid of elections. If he goes to elections now, he'll come back stronger. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at how this whole move transformed Lapid in public opinion amongst his own camp, amongst the left, when you hear, you hear praise for Lapid from people who in the past really despised him and, dishonored him or didn't respect him. So I think that that's not necessarily the big deal. Will the rotation agreement be fulfilled or not? I think that Naftali Bennett, if it was up to Naftali Bennett, he would fulfill the agreement. But there are enough elements around who don't want Lapid to become prime minister, starting from Benny Gantz, going on to Ayelet Shaked and Gidon Saar, would probably prefer, right, to not go down in history as those who sat under Yair Lapid as premiers.
And just one more comment on Lapid, and then I'm going to get to one more question and then audience questions. Lapid, I think, got a lot of political capital across the spectrum in Israel because he basically sacrificed his political ambitions in order to make this coalition government possible. And that is, I would say, unusual in politics anywhere in the world, and certainly in Israel. Would you agree?
Totally. Yes, and that's what that is what I meant. I think that Lapid went through this kind of he grew up in front of his eyes, in front of everyone's eyes, and I think that people didn't believe him, and people still don't believe him, by the way. But I think that really he manufactured and manipulated and manifested, whatever.
Manifest.
Okay, with also, by the way, not only Lapid, Avigdor Lieberman is this crucial player here, very much, and Gidon Saar is also a crucial player here, but all of these players right together, and of course Mansour Abbas, who is worth probably a webinar of its own because of what he is doing, right? And if there's one person who's like the most amazing in this government, is probably Mansour Abbas. But I do think that Lapid is also, you hear, and I say, you hear public opinion about him also growing up. That being said, in this government, Lapid is breaking a lot of his promises, his past promises as well. Lapid built a career on preaching about different politics and clean politics and no jobs and no appointments and no corruption. And at the end of the day, the government he established, is one of the largest in Israel's history, right? The amount of ministers who quit the Knesset through the Norwegian law, the Norwegian bill, meaning that there are about 21 extra Knesset members, which means a lot of money every year. Just now during the budget, they had part of the budget, tradition is that there's something called coalition money, coalition budget, which is besides the budget, there's money that the finance ministry gives out to specific parties or specific individuals in the coalitions to specific goals. Now, when Netanyahu used to do that with the Haredim, then Lapid used to call that corrupt money. And now he's doing it himself. So I think that Lapid, in many ways, he will have to reinvent himself because part of his agenda, he won't be able to use it again. I think that's politics and then kind of, welcome to politics. Politics is about using money and allocating it and using it in order to make politics, but just he himself and his own party, which kind of, had this platform of talking about a new, clean politics that won't be able to work anymore. So he'll have to find a new agenda, and this achievement will give him that agenda in many manners.
So one more question from me, and then I'm turning to audience questions. Many of these recent developments on the Israeli-Palestinian front, including the settlement announcements and the NGO designation, as well as confidence-building measures, fall under the purview of the Defense Ministry, which is led by Benny Gantz. What is Gantz's role in shaping this government's policies towards the West Bank and the Palestinians, and what are his political motivations?
Well, I think Gantz, first of all, his political motivation is to become prime minister. Gantz feels he's been deprived of his premiership. In a way, is right in many ways because Netanyahu, Netanyahu broke their agreement. And also, he's not very sad. He's not happy about the fact that Lapid is going to become prime minister, who's like, his one of his biggest political enemies. And he's also, I think he wakes up in the morning every morning and he sees Bennett as prime minister, and he comes from a party of 6 seats, while Gantz comes from a party of 8 seats, and he says, well, that could have been me. And I think he wakes up every morning feeling that he made this huge sacrifice for this government, which is not acknowledged. And he just thinks that Benny Gantz does believe that he will become prime minister. He just thinks it'll take some more time. And that's his political motivation. I don't think he'll bring down the government actively, but if he does have an excuse to bring down the government, he will use it. That being said, his political agenda he's trying to build himself as a modern Yitzhak Rabin. And this is something that we didn't see from Benny Gantz before. Like under Netanyahu, we didn't see Benny Gantz really having, he was kind of like a novice, and like Netanyahu also didn't give him any room for diplomatic maneuvers. Bennett, because everyone knows that Benny Gantz is unsatisfied, so both Bennett and Lapid kind of give Gantz room to build himself and to kind of create himself as a diplomatic actor. And meeting Abbas was one of his first moves on that front. And I think that he's trying to present himself as the most senior official who is creating a dialogue, who is handling a dialogue with the Palestinian Authority, and kind of, if we're talking about shalom batuach, like a safe peace. So he's not going to lead to peace, but he will be the one who will be giving out, tenders to the Palestinians as well. Together with the 3,000 settlement units, he also approved for the first time in many years tenders for Palestinians in Area C, and other gestures and other, confidence building moves with the Palestinians. Of course, bolstering the security and financial relationship between Israel and the PA. And in many ways, I think he's rebranding himself through like using the relationship with the Palestinian Authority. He's rebranding himself. Just to add one thing on that matter, it's interesting to see there's like this small, it's not small, but there's this delicate fight between Gantz and Merav Michaeli over who is the modern Rabin. Merav Michaeli, as leader of the Labor Party, does not like the fact that Benny Gantz is walking around and branding himself as a modern Yitzhak Rabin and is trying to own back, the branding. And last week, when the Labor Party attacked Gantz for approving the settlements, they attacked him by saying, he's no Rabin. Someone who approves of these settlements, he's no Rabin. So, and that is basically also because they're actually the same base, right? At the end of the day, Benny Gantz, in any other world, he could also be the leader of the Labor Party, but he decided to go on his own path. But we see them basically fighting the same electorate, same, I would say, moderate left electorate. And that's new because in the past, I think that Benny Gantz was much more looking to the right. And I think that since this government has been established, he's kind of much more focused on building himself as a centrist. And of course, he's trying to brand Merav Michaeli as this crazy progressive leftist while she's trying to bite into the legacy of Rabin. So this is kind of this mini credit fight going on all the time, which will continue.
So I'm going to turn to our audience questions. Elaine Cohen asks Tal, there has been a surge of settler violence in recent weeks. Has Gantz or anyone in the Knesset spoken out about this? Is there a designation in Israel of domestic terrorists? And if so, in what situations has it been applied or could it be?
So yes, there has been a spike in settler violence, and as far as I know, Benny Gantz has not been, hadn't condemned it publicly. Of course, much of this violence has been has been directed to IDF soldiers, so it has been addressed by, the chief of staff, but not by Benny Gantz directly. There are designation, or there have been attempts. Oh, and that being said, inside the Knesset and inside the coalition, Meretz have been demanding, and some of the labor MKs have been demanding Gantz to treat this and have been criticizing Gantz for not treating these events with the right, with a strict voice and with a strong voice. There are internal domestic groups that have been designated as terror organizations, but of course it's much more difficult to designate Jewish groups as a terror organization, and this is something that happens very, very rarely. The issue of the settler violence is, of course, even more problematic in this coalition, because if you think of a right-wing, in the past 12 years, we had, a mostly hegemonic or mostly, homogenic right-wing coalition, in which it's much easier for them to deal with, I think, with Jewish terror, with Jewish extremism. In this government, which you have this very small right-wing elements who are under a lot of pressure from the outside, they'll be much less declined to deal with it. That being said, it is, it's under Shin Bet auspices. So at the end of the day, it's really an issue of security risk.
Naomi Weiner asks, with the fragility of the current coalition, how likely are, you can hear me, right? Okay, I know it says unmute myself. I am unmuted, sorry. I'm having technical difficulties today. So Naomi Weiner asks, with the fragility of the current coalition, how likely are significant changes happening in relationships with the PA and the Israeli Arab sector, or for that matter, strategic changes in dealing with Hamas in Gaza?
Okay. So we have three different categories here. First of all, and maybe we should just talk about that first. What's going on with the Israeli Arab sector is really, I think, the probably the most important achievement of this government. Last week, the government approved a second 5-year plan for the Arab sector, which basically is supposed to put in 30 billion shekels for the next 5 years in the Arab sector. Last week, the government also approved for the first time a significant, not for the first time, but a significant plan to combat and to battle and to fight the violence and the crime in the Arab sector, which has been growing up. Now, the fact that there's an Arab partner in this coalition, the fact that there's an Arab partner, Arab minister in the government, and the fact that Arab parties, Arab politicians have been part of the discussions of allocating, how to allocate the budget, have been part of the discussions on the priorities of this government. That is revolutionary by itself. Of course, Alam are under a lot of pressure, but this is a model that hasn't been used in Israel for decades, probably ever, because really Abbas is a really significant player in the coalition. And I think that if only for this, I mean, just for the success of this model, because at the end of the day, when we see Arab participation in the highest levels and Arabs are part of the priority and part of the everyday discussion in the government, this by itself has a significant impact on the future and of the discourse and coexistence between Israelis and Arabs together. For the first time, up until 3 or 4 years, Arab MKs were not considered, independent players. They were considered just, the messengers of the Palestinian Authority. And for the first time, they have their own agenda, they have a voice, and they're being part of the discussion. So that's the most important, that's the only place where this government will probably make a revolution. Now, regarding the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, I think it's too early to call, it's a delicate situation, which not necessarily Israel is the most important factor inside, right? Because we have the internal division inside that within the Palestinians, which makes everything so much more complicated. I do think that the main change of policy, of course, will be that relationships, as opposed to Netanyahu's government to really try to weaken the Palestinian Authority, this government does say out loud that it is not trying to weaken the Palestinian Authority. It's not saying the Palestinian Authority is our partner, not to go that so far, but does acknowledge that the Palestinian Authority are the moderates that Israel needs to cooperate with. And there are far more voices calling for cooperation than we ever had. Of course, this is not a government that will sign a peace agreement, not an interim agreement, but it could make life for Palestinians better. By work permits, both Palestinians and Gaza. At large, this is a government who wants to move to open up some of the things that have been stuck in the past 12 years. And I think that one of the issue that has been stuck is Israel between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. I'm going 1 second, just quiet my phone.
No problem.
I'm back.
Thanks, Tal. Did you have more you wanted to add on the issue with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and all that?
So just to say on the issue with Hamas, it really depends. Also, Israel is not necessarily a lone player. It depends on how relationships with Egypt go and where Egypt wants to take this relationship. We saw a very warm meeting between Bennett and Sisi, and Bennett was invited to Egypt openly and publicly, which does, reflect a warm up in the relationship. And again, does not necessarily, Israel might want to, the new government might want to cut off relationships with Hamas, but it also might be under pressure from Egypt to move forward with, with previous moves
Initiatives.
and with the initiatives and moves that were underway. At the end of the day, it'll be managing the conflict from both sides. The difference will be in tone and in confidence. Netanyahu was very strong and very confident, and you couldn't question him on anything. This is a government that questions itself every day internally. So in many ways, it is obliged to become more moderate. That of course, a lot depends on how the Hamas itself and how our neighbors will treat the situation, right? If there's, God forbid, a rocket attack on Israel, then this might be a government that will have to react differently than the way Netanyahu used to react.
We have a question from Robert Sugarman, who's a member of our board. He asks, there's also the issue of movement toward construction in Givat HaMatos and E1, and of course elsewhere, Pisgat Ze'ev, Atarot. What is the status of that? Is this activity a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the coalition agreement? What, if anything, can those committed to a two-state outcome do to head this off? And I would just add to Bob's very good question, this also is something that really contradicts the messaging that's coming out of the Biden administration. So you have that element as well.
So yeah, I think that what's going on with E1, Givat HaMatos, and also Atarot, there's also a Jewish neighborhood planned in Atarot. That is part of where Bennett is out of control, because some of these tenders are moving forward under the auspices of the housing ministry, which is led by Ze'ev Elkin, and the planning ministry, the interior ministry, which is in charge of the planning committees, which is led by Ayelet Shaked. And also some of these are being promoted by the Jerusalem mayor himself, Moshe Leon, who of course is associated with Avigdor Lieberman, but also comes from a right-wing Likudnik background. And I think that at some point Bennett will have to stop. He'll come under international pressure, as you said, to halt all of these initiatives. We should say, all of the planning procedures in Israel are so complicated. So even when you hear that Givat HaMatos has moved forward another stage, there's probably usually always 3 more stages that it has to go through. And I think that at some point Bennett will have to stop them. But that of course, because these are 3 specifically contentious projects, which can really create a huge international uproar, not necessarily, by the way, the US and the Biden administration, but I think with Europe even more. And I just don't think that the government wants to rock its ship so much, and it doesn't want to have these diplomatic instances. So I think that Bennett will try to kill them quietly. In the past, Netanyahu knew how to kill these privately. During 12 years, all of these projects, Givat HaMatos, E1, and Atarot, they all existed 12 years ago, and they were stalled. It'll be more difficult for Bennett to do so because he's weak and he's under pressure from the outside. Everything that he does, he has 30 Likudniks shouting that he's selling Israel to the left and to the Arabs. So he's under a very strong propaganda campaign. But I think that at the end of the day, he'll act exactly like Netanyahu did, and he'll just halt them or freeze them, try to do it quietly, and wake up the other day and discover that he's under scrutiny.
So we have 3 questions that are all kind of along the same theme. So I'm going to ask them all because they're related, and then I'll give you the chance to answer. So Bob Sugarman is also asking, if the coalition breaks apart, what is the expectation of who will win the next election? And then we have another question: if the government collapses, would Bennett, Yamina, cross the electoral threshold and find, well, then there's a question: if the budget passes, what could bring the government down before the change from Bennett to Lapid, which I think you touched on, but maybe you want to elaborate.
Okay, so let's start with what can bring the government down. What can bring the government down could be, worst case scenario, a security incident, which would make it very difficult for Ram to continue to be part of the government. Not just one security incident, but if we get into, a long-term security situation or confrontation, which includes casualties from the Palestinian side or any other side. Any violent flare-up can bring down this coalition. And the way it will do it, it probably would do it through, as I said, Benny Gantz has an ongoing offer from the Likud bloc to come and join them and be their prime minister. He just needs an excuse. So one can imagine that if, again, God forbid, because I don't want to have a security situation, but one can imagine that we have 3 weeks of flare-up with Gaza, and at the end of in which the government coalition becomes shaky because, Ra'am find it difficult to support the government who's fighting in Gaza and killing people in Gaza. And we can imagine Benny Gantz come out and say, listen, this is not a government that is good for Israel. I have decided that maybe it's time to shake up the government, and then they'll build a different government through a constructive vote of no confidence. Again, Gantz needs a good excuse for that, and he also needs to have the courage to do that, which not necessarily he'll have each of them. About Bennett and his electoral situation. Yeah, Bennett is doing bad in the polls. Bennett thought that he would, originally, Bennett thought he knew that he would suffer from anger and fury from his voters after establishing this government. But he was under the impression that after a few months of, meeting Joe Biden, meeting President Putin, meeting Assisi, going to Glasgow, going to the UN, handling the corona, by the way, handling the 4th wave of the corona successfully, bringing Israel to be the first with the 3rd vaccine. Bennett expected to be in a totally different place where he was now. He thought that at some point he would gain support, but no, he's doing very bad at the polls. Well, in most of the polls, he's exactly where he was at the election, meaning 6 seats. But some polls show that he doesn't pass the threshold. Mind you, the polls that show that he doesn't pass the threshold are made by right-wing pollsters that are identified with Netanyahu, so they are a bit less credible. But yes, even if he has 6 seats in the polls, as we know, if you take the margin of error, 6 seats is not that much, not that far away from 4. And Bennett has a problem because it's not clear who his base is. It's not clear that the right-wing voters will ever forgive him. And the center-left voters who are very happy with the way are happy with the government and think he's doing okay, they just won't vote for him because at the end of the day, he's Naftali Bennett and he's a leader of a settler party. He also has this very weird party, right, left with him. He has a national religious party, most of them, besides Ayelet Sheked, all of them are Masorti, national religious, but most of their voters and most of the people who support this government are not from that sector in society. So Bennett is in a challenge. I assume that towards the next, there's a question, will Bennett continue in politics after he's prime minister? There's a speculation that he's not. He's a young man. As different from other politicians in Israel, he didn't grow up in politics. It's his 2nd career, even his 3rd career after a few years in the army, many years in high tech, and only, in the past 15 years, has politics been his main issue in life. And he's also young. So in 4 years' time, he'll be 53 years old. That's enough time to go and make back another startup. And if you're doing that after you were the prime minister of Israel, you'll probably have some good PR around the world. So it's not, and it's not clear that, you know, if he goes, what after you've been prime minister, then what, do you go back to become just like a leader of a small 6-seat party? So one of the speculations is that Bennett will leave politics. The other speculation is that Bennett will join forces with one of the parties in his coalition. The immediate suspect is Gidon Saar, New Hope, who are in even a worse situation than Bennett in the polls. They really scratched the threshold in the polls. And also there are speculations that in some instances that Bennett and Benny Gantz could find themselves cooperating, as Benny Gantz has also, many, he's more centrist, and he has many national religious kippah, people with kippah in his party. So that could be a collaboration that could happen. And regarding who will win the next election, that's a big question, because I don't know who's going to be running. I don't know if Netanyahu is going to be running. I don't know if new actors will be running. And also, who will win the next election? We saw Netanyahu supposedly won the last election because he was the largest party, but Bennett with 6 seats became prime minister. And one of the big problems, I think, for us commentators and analysts and political junkies after this incident with Bennett becoming prime minister with 6 seats is that we really can't predict who will be the next government. Like, now that there's this precedent, and it'll be about at the end of the day, after the next election, there could be another Naftali Bennett who will be, the deal breaker and play his cards right, and at the end of the day, with 5 seats, become prime minister. This whole divide between Netanyahu and not Netanyahu, kind of put the whole system in this crazy situation where someone from a party of 6 seats is prime minister, and it is, I would say, an ivut, definitely an ivut.
Conflict?
No, ivut. It's
okay, I don't know that one. Sorry.
It's not normal. Okay. It's
okay.
It's that's not like it's a false of the system. It's not normal to have a prime minister of 6 seats representing a party of 6 seats, even though it's legitimate and that's the system, but it just represents this huge lacune in the system that could now turn into a precedent, and that makes it really impossible to predict who's going to win the next election, because as far as I know, it could be the smallest party around who'll just be the last one, he'll just be the one who will have the best cards to bargain with both sides.
Tal, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. And I think you've shown once again why we love having you on our webinars. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Once again, I want to thank our supporters who are with us on today's call. Your generosity makes programs like this one possible. So again, if you have not yet done so, please consider making a contribution today at www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of our website. As always, I also encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Koplo column in your email inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding our next video briefing. Until then, thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you soon.